Welcome to DIY Guitar Making at Eric Schaefer Guitars, where I share my knowledge and experience as a professional acoustic guitar maker in order to promote the craft that we all love called lutherie. In this episode, I'm going to explain what I do differently in my bending process when I'm using either very figured woods like curly maple or flamed koa or something like that, or just difficult woods that I would say have an unpredictable grain orientation. Now, every species of wood is going to behave differently when you're bending it, so really it's best, ideally you would figure out the particulars for whatever species of wood you plan on using, but the only way of truly figuring out those particulars are to go through several iterations of bending. However, I have found personally that there is a process that I use on any wood with unpredictable grain, and it tends to have pretty good results across the board, whether I'm dealing with certain figured wood or Cerakote or tiger myrtle or whatever unusual wood that I come across. So first, let me start by telling you what this video is not going to be. It's not going to cover everything you need to know about bending sides. It's not going to cover the basics of bending sides. I did another video series on that called Using a Side Bending Machine. It's a 3-part series, so check that out first. And I think that's going to provide all the background information for this video to make sense. I also teach hand bending, if that's what you plan on doing. I teach that in my online course, Building an OM Acoustic. But if you're bending with a machine, just check out the 3-part series on my YouTube channel. So if you've already checked that out and you're up to date on the basics of bending, let's get right into it and let's talk about how to bend a difficult set of sides. So this is a set of Cerakote sides that I just bent, and this is a great example of what I was talking about with unpredictable grain. So if you look at the direction of the grain that you see here on this set of sides, it's a little bit more ambiguous. It crosses over in various places. It's not just running straight parallel to the direction of the side. Contrast that with this set of mahogany sides here, which is incredibly predictable and straight. So this would be an example of a wood that is not particularly difficult to bend. So Cerakote is actually a great example here because I've heard a lot of conflicting reports from different people about it being a really easy wood to bend and also it being a really difficult wood to bend where it fractures and breaks. And the reason for those two conflicting reports is just that, like I said, it's unpredictable. So you actually could have an easy set of Cerakote, and this in fact felt very easy when I bent it, so I think this happened to be a good set. But because that grain is unpredictable, you really need to treat woods like this like they're going to be difficult. So I'm going to show you a second set of Cerakote that I have over here, and you'll see that this one actually was far more difficult than this one, even though they're both Cerakote. Okay, so here we are. Same species, Cerakote, but as you can see, there's a lot more going on here. And the grain gets really wacky in some places, like up in here. And then, of course, what really stands out is just the fact that you have your difference between the heartwood and the sapwood there. And these two sides of the side actually behaved very differently under the heating blanket. And so that also added to the difficulty of bending a side like this. So what specifically do I do to make bends like this a little bit more reliable? So just like I teach in my online course, Building an OM Acoustic, and I think I also talk about this a little bit in the 3-part machine bending series that I put on YouTube, there are 5 factors that affect your bending that will factor into it either being a success or a failure. And those 5 factors are thickness, moisture, heat, pressure, and grain direction, which we've already talked about grain direction here. The whole reason I include grain direction is because you want to limit problems with grain direction by selecting woods that have a very predictable and straight grain. Now in this case, of course, we've chosen to challenge ourselves with something with difficult grain, so that's just something we have to deal with. So we can throw grain direction right off that list, and now we just have 4 factors to consider. So let's start with thickness. So for a wood like this, when I'm thicknessing it, I'll thickness it down to 75 thousandths of an inch, and then go specifically to the waist and sand an additional 10 thousandths of an inch thinner, which brings me to 65 thousandths of an inch, which is absolutely as thin as you ever want to go on a set of sides. You don't want to ever end up, or at least at this stage, thinning your sides any thinner than that. Normally on much easier woods, I'll thickness the sides down to 90 thousandths of an inch, maybe 85 thousandths of an inch, because I can get away with that, and that leaves me a lot more thickness, so I can avoid problems later on from starting with over-thin sides. I talk about the problem with thinning your sides out too much in a recent video I did. So now let's talk about moisture. I find that a lot of plain figured woods do well with moisture, but a lot of these exotic hardwoods, and certainly figured woods, anything that's described as curly or flamed or beeswing, they do not do well with moisture or with excessive moisture, meaning you don't want to soak figured sides, or I don't like to soak even sides like this that have very unpredictable grain. So rather than soaking them, I just spritz them with warm water before putting them under the blanket. Some people say to do a really light spritz. I actually do a pretty heavy spritz. In my mind, at least, I'm not soaking them in water, and I've never noticed any problems from spritzing a little too much. More so, you just want to avoid soaking them in water for 15 minutes like you would with a set of plain mahogany or cherry or something like that. So for heat, for difficult sides and figured sides, I will let the heating blanket get quite a bit hotter before I even start bending than I would for plain sides. So normally for a plain set of sides, I would wait until the heating blanket gets up to about 220, 212, basically your boiling temperature, and then I'll start to bend it. And as I'm bending, the heating blanket will continue to rise, and it will usually settle. If I control it correctly with the controller, I'll try and keep that temperature around 240. With difficult or figured woods, I'm going to let that go much higher to about 280 before I even start to bend. And then that temperature will usually kind of bounce around 280, might climb a little over. I generally don't like to see the temperature go up above 320-ish. So you want to try and bounce it around 280 if you can. Because what you're really doing there is you're living a little dangerously as far as scorching is concerned. But at that point, when you're dealing with difficult or unpredictable woods, you have enough experience and you're willing to risk a little bit of scorching perhaps in order to not have any splits or compression marks on the other side of the bend. And doing this, I've never totally toasted a set of sides to the point where there's burn marks on the show face. But I'm always aware of the fact that I'm probably pretty close to that point. So once I've made a complete bend, I make sure that I turn off the heat immediately and let it settle down. Whereas with a plain set of sides, I would actually let it bake a little longer at temperature for about 2 to 5 minutes before turning it off. With these, I turn it off right away because I've already gotten it screaming hot in order to get that bend, and I don't want to let it bake any longer than it has to. And lastly is pressure. So with difficult woods, I'll simply go a little slower when I'm machine bending these woods. I would also go slower if I was hand bending. I just haven't hand bent a side in a while since I basically switched over to machine bending. But either way, just take your time with these woods. I found that the Zero Coat was actually pretty compliant once I got it up to temperature, but that's not always the case with woods like this, even within the species of Zero Coat, because again, from one sample to another, you can have very different results when it comes to bending. So I hope this helps answer some questions that people have with particular woods. I get questions about this a lot. Usually people are asking about a specific type of wood, and yes, every type of wood has sort of its own particular way that it wants to be bent. However, I find that what I've just described here will work with most of these difficult species. It's sort of my go-to when I'm bending a species of wood that I've never bent before. If you learned something here, please give this video a like and subscribe so you can be notified when I release a new DIY guitar making video every Friday. And if you want to really learn more, take one of my structured online courses at ericschaferguitars.com or register for a hands-on guitar building workshop here with me in Burnville, Pennsylvania.